We're going to be talking about population growth. This is chapter 11 in the book Ecology, Concepts and Applications by Manuel, Molles and Sher. It was published in 2019 by McGraw-Hill, and it's the 8th edition. I'm Sue Glenn, and we're going to concentrate today's presentation on geometric growth and exponential growth. Last chapter, we were talking about ways of estimating different population parameters, including the growth rate of the population, and we looked at trying to figure out how many offspring were left by an individual in an initial time, in a single time period. So we're going to start talking about the simplest case that we were talking about last chapter, and that was looking at a population where we have lots of space, lots of resources, nothing stopping it, and it has the non-overlapping generations. And so we're finding that the population size at a given time is equal to the population that you started with. So the number of individuals at a time equals the initial number of individuals, and then we were multiplying that by the geometric rate of increase, which is the lambda. And we had worked out calculating that lambda last time for a population of phlox, of annual plant with non-overlapping generation time. And so if you were going to predict the number the next year from the number you started with this year, so you have this number of seeds, and then you multiply that by lambda, you can get the number that you'll have the next year. And for the phlox, the lambda, if you remember, was 2.4177, and that was in chapter 10. If you're going to do that for the next year, you multiply it by lambda again, and lambda again, lambda again. And so you're multiplying it by the geometric rate of increase dependent on t, which is your number of time steps or time intervals or generations. And for an annual plant, that would be years. So we have the number at a given time equals the number at an initial time times lambda raised to the power of t, where t is your time intervals, and that varies with different types of species. And remember, the geometric rate of increase was the average number of offspring left by an individual during one time interval. So when we were talking about this before, we had this really pretty phlox plant that produced lots and lots of seeds. And so if we started with 996 individuals, which were the seeds in the first year, and we knew that the geometric rate of increase was 2.4177, you could predict how many plants you'd have at the different time intervals. And we worked through this last time. So using that, we can use the equation that the number at a given time equals the number you started with times lambda, that growth rate. And for each year, for each time step, you're multiplying it by that growth rate. So for these phlox plants, we know we started with 996, and we calculated the growth rate as 2.4177. And so now we can see how many plants you would have after 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, 8 years. So the calculations are pretty simple. You should be able to do this, that the number at time 1 equals the number you started with, 996 times 2.4177 raised to the power of 1. So it's just 996 times 2.4177, which when you multiply that out on your calculator is 2,408. So we go from a population of 996 to 2,408. Well, what about in 2 years? So that's going to be times the growth rate squared. So it's the growth rate times the growth rate. for each year. Do that in your calculator, work it out, you'll end up with 5,822 plants. And what about 4 years? Same thing. We have the 996 we started with times the geometric growth rate, but this time to the power of 4 because we've got four time steps. And you do that in your calculator, you're going to get 34,031 plants. Well, let's say we have it going for 8 years. And 996 times the growth rate to the power of 8 equals a whopping 1,162,729 plants. Now, bear in mind that maybe there's not going to be enough room for all those plants. Maybe there's other factors that are going to limit this population size, which is certainly what we get into in the next chapter. Let's try plotting this data and see what it looks like. So we have the axes set up here. The y-axis is going to be the number of plants. The x-axis is going to be years. So I'll put years across here. And population size, which is n, up there. And so we started with 996. We'll just put the data across here, year 4. And then year 8 is way up here. This was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I got these going up here by 200,000, 400,000, 800,000. Here's a million. And then it's just shy of 1.2 million. So if we connect these guys up, we've got something that looks like this, which is exponential growth. But since this is geometric, we had non-overlapping generations. This is a nicer looking graph out of your textbook showing you the same thing, but probably much clearer to look at. So this is pretty incredible because our flocks population in 8 years reached over 1 million individuals. By 16 years, the population would be over 1 billion billion individuals. In 24 years, the population could top 1 trillion individuals, and by 40, it would increase to 1 billion individuals. So let's really, let's say we've got this plant in North America, which is about 24 million square kilometers. If we assume a uniform density across the continent, by 32 years, the population would reach a density of nearly 80 million individuals per square kilometer, or about 80 individuals per square meter across the entire continent, which, going from southern Mexico to northern Canada and Alaska, which is unlikely that it could live in all of those places. And 8 years after that, the density would be nearly 90,000 individuals per square meter. So obviously this is unrealistic. The population would be so dense the plants would die because it wouldn't have enough nutrients, enough light, water, and it would be in climates that it really couldn't actually live very well in. But you do get the idea that populations produce so many more individuals than are going to survive. And this is a basis of natural selection, is that you produce more offspring that can survive. So the ones that actually do survive are the ones that are best fit for the environment. So the take-home message from this is that populations have a large capacity for growth, that they can do this in a short period of time if they have the right conditions, but they certainly cannot carry this on for many generations just because of other limitations to the population size. The picture in the background on this slide is Cat Island in Japan, where there's a few of these in Japan where they have these huge cat populations. There's also a Rabbit Island in Japan as well. We were talking about geometric population growth, so let me just geometric population growth. And we had the equation. I'm just going to write that here. The number at a given time equals the number we started with, the initial population, times lambda. That is raised to the power of t, the time steps. And remember from the last chapter, we had calculated that lambda as the number that you have divided by the number that you had previously. So the number at time t plus 1 divided by the number that you had previously. I'm sure you've studied exponential growth before in algebra class and biology class, so this should look pretty familiar to you. Exponential growth is the form of population growth that we were looking at for geometric growth, but in this case we can use this with continuous populations in an unlimited environment where they have overlapping generations. And if we look at this, we can model exponential growth as the change in the population size. So that's the dn, which is like a delta n, over time, the change in time. So we're looking at the rate of population change over time. And the per capita rate of increase is r. So this is the maximum growth rate of the population times the population size. So the bigger the population is, the faster it's going to grow. Small populations grow slowly, large populations grow faster. And we can take this then and use it to calculate your population size at any time. So we've got the population at a given time equals the number we started with, our initial population size, which is your n sub 0, equals the base of the natural logarithms. We are going to use e here. Instead of using a base of 10, we're going to use the base of e. And that is multiplied by your population size for each time step, but also to the power of the population growth rate. So we've got the R max is your per capita rate of increase, and T is your number of time intervals. So the more time intervals, the greater the number of times you're multiplying your initial population size times E. Just for comparison, these are those two equations shown together on the same slide. This is the figure out of your textbook. I love the way that they do this in your book where they break down the equations so that they can show you exactly what each part of the equation is. So the left side has the form of the equation expressed as a rate of population change over time as the product of the per capita rate of increase and the population size. And then the one on the bottom right shows you the equation for calculating the population size at a given time period. And so those are the two equations we just had. So if we're looking at exponential growth, remember we already had geometric growth. And remember with geometric growth, the number at a given time equals the number you started with times the geometric rate of increase raised to the number of time steps. And we had calculated the geometric increase was a simple calculation as the ratio of the population sizes from one time step to the next. Exponential growth, we're looking at the change in the population over time, which equaled the maximum growth rate of the population times the population size. And so you could calculate the number at a given time by the number you started with, just like we did with the geometric growth, but then it is times e. And remember, e is your base of your natural logarithms. It's a constant. So what is it? E is 2.7. Let me just look this up. 2.718. So you're multiplying the population size times, almost 3. And then you're raising that to the power of your growth rate times time steps. So these are multiplying together. So it's times R max times T. Should have put that down there. There we go. That's clear.
Rabbits have always been the symbol for prolific mating. With good reason. Their populations can grow quickly. On average, a female rabbit can have 6 to 10 babies, or kits, in each litter. The mating season extends over a 6-month period, and a rabbit can have 4 or more litters per mating season. So with these impressive numbers, why isn't the Earth covered in rabbits? A population of 2 rabbits increases as they mate and produce a litter. If adult rabbits successfully breed and no individual rabbits die, this population can increase 4-fold each generation. This population explosion is referred to as exponential growth. If a population has no restrictions on growth, such as unlimited food sources or ample habitat, its size can increase exponentially. Let's look at the exponential growth of this population mathematically, starting with one mating pair. The exponential curve follows the equation G equals R times N, where the number of offspring, G, will be equal to the rate of growth, R, which in this case is 3 rabbits per adult, times the initial population size, N, or 2. So in this example, G is 6, because the rate of growth is 3 rabbits per adult, and there were 2 rabbits in the initial population. After each generation, the new rabbits are added to the existing population, such that N in generation 2 equals G plus N from generation 1, or 6 plus 2, which is 8. The population follows an exponential curve that increases in slope each generation. Obviously, this cannot continue forever because other factors affect the growth rate of the population.
We talked about using pollen records in order to look at the movement of trees following the melting of the glaciers at the end of the last ice age in earlier chapters. And here we are looking at an example of a study done in Britain by Bennett, and he was looking at the population sizes of Scots pine by looking at the number of pollen grains that he found accumulated in the sediments in the bottoms of ponds and lakes. And you can age those sediments with carbon dating, and so you can see how many pollen grains you found at the different times after the end of the Pleistocene. And we can see that when the glaciers melted, we have very small populations initially accumulating, and then as the years go on, the population is growing exponentially until it sort of reaches its potential within 500 years of those ice glaciers melting, ice sheets. Here's an example of a very small population that was in danger of extinction. The whooping crane, it nests up in Canada, and it spends its winters down on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And because of hunting and habitat destruction, it was reduced down. 1940, there were 22 individuals left in the population. And so that was protected in both countries, and so it was put on the endangered species list, and parks were set aside for its wintering grounds and for its breeding grounds. And we can see that with that protection, it has been growing exponentially, so that obviously there's favorable conditions now, and the species can take advantage of that. Here's an example we have talked about before. We talked about the uh, Eurasian colored dove population spreading across from, remember, from Turkey, it spread into Europe from, we talked about this when we're talking about changes in population distributions. And the Eurasian colored dove then showed that if we just look at its population in Great Britain, in less than 20 years, it was able to grow very rapidly. But we can see that the growth rate is not as rapid as you would predict from exponential growth, which means something is happening that is going to be slowing down the population growth rate as it gets larger and larger. And these are some sorts of environmental limitations, and clearly the exponential growth model is not adequate in order to explain what's going on here. And the next section of the chapter will be talking about those limitations and using the logistic population growth model. When you look at the review questions at the ends of this section, the first question asks, why do many populations of invasive species, such as that Eurasian colored doves in Europe, grow at exponential rates for some time following their introduction to a new environment? Also, one of the questions asks about the African annual killifish. The African annual killifish spends part of its life cycle in the eggs that are down in the mud, and then it will grow up and live in these temporary ponds during the wet season. And then once again, at the end of the season, it's laid its eggs, and so it'll spend the dry season down in the mud. So this is sort of like an annual plant, but this is an annual fish. So which model of population growth, geometric or exponential growth, would be adequate for looking at these population growth of this population? And then it goes on to ask you about guppies, because you can have overlapping generations with guppies. You have populations with mixed age classes and year-round reproduction. So which model of population growth, geometric or exponential, would work with these guys? So with exponential growth, is unlimited growth realistic? And what would start to slow down the rates of population growth? And that's where we'll be talking about logistic growth models when you join part of the chapter. So take a look at your review questions at the ends of the chapters, the concept review questions. Also investigating the evidence 11, which is at the back of this textbook, on estimating the number of species in a community, which is different from looking at the population size. So see you in the next section.